Hello and welcome to this NevilleResearch.com video. Today we are going to learn to read secretary hand with Henry Neville. So we have this letter here from May 1600 when Neville was in Paris. He was ambassador to France. And we're going to go through this letter word by word and learn to read the secretary hand and discuss some of the features of his handwriting. Now, this letter is written in Neville's absolutely fanciest secretary hand. He's using a very formal style. And the reason he's writing in such a formal style is because this is a letter of reference, essentially, for John Thorpe, the architect. And he's writing the letter to Robert Cecil, and we have many, many, many examples of Neville writing letters to Robert Cecil, and he almost always begins them with the words right honorable. So here you can see he's written this R in the fanciest way he can. And then above here, I have another example from a letter written about the same time, which is a less formal handwriting. Both of these are written by Henry Neville, but he varied his handwriting style in different letters. So I want to compare up here. You can see how this capital R is less formal, more rushed. It doesn't even have all the same, like this base here is very simple, and this is very elaborate. So Neville is doing his best to make this letter look as formal as possible, as official as possible. And we go, the I is a typical, what you'd expect. The G here, this is a typical G that Neville would make, but here it's a little fancier, and this descender here is actually pretty unusual. He usually doesn't descend this low on his letters. Now, this H, though, I want to pay special attention to, because the H in the letter and the H he uses throughout his formal correspondence, for him is a more formal way of writing the H. And this way of writing an H, which is probably was more common at the time in secretary hand, he uses in less formal contexts. So this is one of the key markers of how formal or informal his writing is. And then the T, once again, this is a more formal way he wrote T and a less formal way. So here again, you can see this H. This is the less formal H, and then here he has it as formal style. And the rest of the word is almost pretty similar in how he writes it out. He always writes honorable. That's an O. He writes a double N, an O. And this is the typical way he writes an R. A-B-L-E. So right honorable. And this part is pretty much the same in all his correspondence. But the big differences, one of the big differences between his formal and informal style is this H. Now here we have a capital B, and I like to call this a 23B because it looks like there's a 2 and there's a 3 and the line between them. And this is his formal way of writing a B. It was a very common way of writing a B in secretary hand, but Neville also wrote B in other ways as well. Then you have two E's. Those are E's, so double E. And this looks like an M, or it could be NI or IN, but it's, and that's a very common way in secretary hand. People would just run these minuscules together. So it's ING and then G. So it's being. This is an E, A, R, N, another E, and then we have this ST ligature. This is the very formal way he would write S and T together in very formal contexts, and then LY. So earnestly. Then we have a capital D, E. Now here is an S, and the thing about these are difficult to recognize in secretary hand, these S's, because they can look like the F's. Just like in printed text of the time, the S and the F's can look similar. So the way to know that this is an S is there's no closed loop here. There's only one loop total. and then Y, that's another R, E, and then D. So we're going to see a lot of different D's in this document. So here's a D here, and if you look down here, there's another D. They look completely different. Neville varied how he wrote his D's, and that's just a variance within documents and across documents. So we'll see lots of examples of D's looking different, and we'll be watching out for that. So it's capital D, so it's D-E-S-Y-R-E-D, desired. It's a B and a Y, by. And here's a very formal capital M. It's really the most formal way he could write it. An R with a period, so this is a Mr. And then here he's written Thorpe. So this capital T with a dot in the middle is a fancy way of him writing it. The fancy H, O-R, P also, we'll see a lot of variance in how he writes his P's, and then E, a fancy E at the end. So we get Thorpe. 1. Now here's an F, and F at the end of a word. It has the 2 loops. He changed how he wrote this. Sometimes these were more open, sometimes they're closed. But this is a typical way he would write of. And here is the. And I brought over 2 examples of the from a letter written exactly the same time. And you can see the difference. The T is much less formal here. The H is a different style completely. His less formal H. And the E is also different. So Neville had 2 ways of writing an E. This is sort of the more formal E. In this letter, he's using the more formal E. And sometimes looks like an epsilon. And these E's are more typical in his less formal writing. And they look like an O with a line in the middle. So he varies this, and you'll see sometimes both E's in the same document. But this is something we can look forward to seeing in his handwriting all the time, this variance. Here we have a capital C, L, E, R. That's a K. Another E really looks like an epsilon. And then that's an S at the end there. And this flourish at the top is really not that typical for him. It's a little exaggerated for him because it's a formal letter. So this is that's a capital C. So it's clerks of, same of, similar to the one we saw over here. These 2 ofs look pretty similar. And that's her, H-E-R. So to read the whole thing, it's right honorable, period, being earnestly desired by Mr. Thorpe, one of the clerks of her. Okay, so that's the first line. Now the next line, we have another one of these very fancy M's. We have an A, and then a superscript, we have T-I-E-S. And this is typically the way he wrote a Majesty. He's abbreviated. This was a common abbreviation, and this is usually the way he would abbreviate a Majesty in his letters. Now, this W here with this long descender is not typical of his handwriting. He usually doesn't have descenders that long, but in this formal context, he's doing that. So W-O-R, it looks like a K. This is a very fancy E. And then an S, again, he's got this little flourish there, which is not really that typical for his handwriting. Sometimes he does it, sometimes he doesn't. Now this 2 is interesting because this T is a formal T for him, but it doesn't have any base here. But if we go, and here we go down this document, there's another 2 without the base, and there's another 2 without the base. And they all look similar. They're all a formal style for him. But if you look at this one, he does have a base here on the T. So there's a great deal of variation in his handwriting. Sometimes he'll put the base on the T, sometimes he won't. Now, here is another R with a descender here that's very long. R, E, and this is a C. And these C's are hard to get used to because they don't really look like much of anything. But this is a C. So R-E-C-O, double M, E-N-D, recommend. So this is this D, and you can see how this D varies so much from this D, even though they're both word final. That's a fancy H, I, and here's a more simple S. So like I'm saying, his S is a very great deal. Now here's just one sort of looping down like that. So that is an S, U, T, E, suit. Now this is one of the most difficult letters in secretary hand to get used to because it looks like a B to current day eyes, but it's actually a V as in Victor. So it's unto, U-V-N-T-O, unto, your, Y-O-U-R, and then like we saw, honor, the fancy H, O, a double N, O-U-R. Now here's an F in the beginning of the word, which looks different from the F we saw here at the end of the word. This is how Neville typically wrote an F at the beginning of the word. So this is F-O-R, for. Here's A by itself, and you have this hairline above it. And he only wrote the A like that in formal letters like this. And this was common in secretary hand, but this for him was a formal way of writing A. Here's R, E. Now that's a V as in Victor, E, R, and that's an S, I-O-N. So reversion of one, of, and here's the again. Now this is higher. It's a little hard to read this. So that's his formal A, I, and then a G, H, E, R, higher. Now here's a P, and this is a fancy way he's writing it. He usually did write it with this descender like this, sort of curvy descender going down. But this very angular moving up into the L, this sort of writing is very common, was very common for him. So P-L-A, and that's one of these C's that's hard to tell, E, and then an S. So places. Now, once again, these are these minuscules where it looks, is that an M? Is that N-I? What is going on here? It's in, and that's typical for secretary hand. That, kind, once again, in, that's an R, that's an E, that's an S, here's a P, E, and remember that's a C, and that's a T. So respect, of, some. Here's a trial, the word is trial, and you can see the T is really quite formal for him, a typical R. He's spelling this with a Y, and it is quite a formal Y because it's made with two strokes. Many of his Y's are made with one stroke, but in this formal letter, he's using this double stroke to make the Y coming all the way up. And then he's making A, L-L for trial. So here we have his I, and he varied his I a great deal depending on the formalness of the letter. And this is one of his very formal I's. And over here, I have another example of I in a much less formal context. And you can see just how different it is. This less formal I is very typical for him, more common. But in a letter like this, he'll make this very wedgy I to show the formality. So as we continue on here, that's H, A, that's a V as in Victor, E, have, had, of, his. It's an H, O, looks like a double N here, E, and here's that fancy ST, honest. Now that's a C, A-R-E, so we have care. And Now here's an important thing to learn in secretary hand. That's an S, as you see, and that's a U. But this is a double F. And this double F is very common in secretary hand. It looks like sort of an A with a loop on top, and you'll see this very often. So it's S-U-F-F-I, that's a C, I-E-N, that's very hard to see, but it's a C, Y. So it's sufficiency in, that's hard to read, but that's S-U, that's a C, and then an H, so such, that's things, that's an A like we saw before with the line, and then a more simple S, as, he, hath. Once again, that's a V as in Victor, under, that's an R, taken, for, and here's me, M-E-E, with a very long descender. And then if we look down below here, he spells me with one E. So the spelling variation you're going to see with Neville, he doesn't always spell the same word the same way, even in the same document. Now here's this very formal I we were talking about. Am bold, and you see how this D goes all the way, really covering up the other letters here. To, that's an S, A, and this T has a loop in it, which is a little bit formal for him. I, and this looks like this double F, but the line doesn't go all the way through, because this is actually an S and then an F. So satisfy his, that's an R, E, it's a Q, looks like a modern day Q as well. U, E, and that ST we've been talking about. So request, therein, that's I-N, as, that's a C, so that's much, as, that's a W, I, that's a T with that loop, H-O-U, and another T, so without. Now this is a P, looks a little bit different from the other ones we've seen. R-E, pre, that's an S, U-M, another P. Now with this P, he sort of, there's not really an angle, he sort of curves it up to the T, and this T has no loop. So as you see, there's a lot of variation. Presumption, and then a formal I. May, and look at this D, and compare it with this D up here. Completely different, right? So this kind of variation is important to keep in mind when people compare handwriting, or they try to determine who wrote something based on handwriting. You have to take the variation into account, because one person can write the same word many different ways, and this is a very good example of that. Now here's a little bit difficult one. B-E is pretty obvious, that's an S, and then you have double E, but that's a C, so it's beseech your honors, good, that's an F, A, V as in Victor, favor, that's a T, towards him, the, and then that's an R, A, T-H-E, and this R has a very long line, which is really not typical for Neville, but in this fancy context he's doing it. Rather, and he may be doing it to sort of justify this line here. So he's lengthening this out because he just wants to put the at here. At my, that's an H, humble, that's R, E, C, O, there's double M, E, N, D, and this D is very low, and to the left here, and actually extends past the N. So you'll see D's like this. You'll see D's where there's a loop here from Neville. You'll see a lot of variation on D's within the middle of a word. A-C-I-O-N, so recommendation. So here we have a W, H, I, C, and then this is an H, sort of his less formal H. So the word is which. And then here again we have this less formal H. And this is an S. And he always wrote shall this way with an S that looks like this. So it's shall, A-L-L. That's G-R-E-A-T. It's a loop. L-Y, greatly. That's I-N-C-R-E-A. That's an S. E, increase. My former obligations. My former obligations. And this looks like an abbreviation mark, but I'm not sure what exactly he's abbreviating here. It doesn't look like anything is actually abbreviated. Is and with a completely different, once again, a different D than we've seen before. Bind, another D that's different. So he's varying his word final D's a great deal. Me too, that's an R. Remain as I am. And once again, this and is different. And that's a V as in Victor, so ever. Capital D, that's an S. So desire to be held. And this is his very fancy flourish on his your, and he often signed letters like this. And here he actually does abbreviate honors. So this is RS up here, and then HO for honors. Most with that fancy ST. Dutiful at, that's a C-O-M-M-A, and then a double N, which he did sometimes. D, so commandment. Now on the left here, he puts his location and the date, and he doesn't write this in secretary hand. He writes this in italic, and he often did that. He would write the location and the date in italic. So here he writes from Paris, the 6th of May, and this little circle is sort of a French style, and I think he's using that since he's writing from France. In most of the letters written in England, he didn't mark the date this way. And then at the bottom, we have his typical italic signature. He always signed his name in italic, almost always the same way, almost always with this sort of flourishy line at the bottom. Very typical of his handwriting. He never spelled his name with an E at the end that I know of, or almost never. And these lines also, to fill in the blank space, is something he often did in his letters. So there we go. We've got a full and complete explanation of this letter from Henry Neville. I hope this has helped you in your reading of secretary hand and giving you a better idea of what his formal handwriting is like. Maybe in the next video, we'll go through one of his informal letters and show some of the characteristics of that handwriting. It's quite different, but you'll see the similarities. And the point I'm trying to make with this also is that Henry Neville was somebody who had excellent handwriting and was able to vary his handwriting. And this is important as we examine documents and try to figure out who wrote what and when. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.